The United States only became involved in the Korean War to protect her interests in Japan and sphere of influence in the Pacific. A good essay will show that the question is understood. It will be planned, it will have an opinion, it will provide context, and it will provide an outline in its introduction of the route that the author will take through this particular essay. American involvement in the Korean War was not only the result of her Japanese interests. This is an opinion already being stated. Instead, an array of other factors came into play. Containment can be viewed as the basis for a three-tiered reasoning for US involvement in the conflict. So we're outlining our plan here. Global application, local application, and a domestic message. Most prominent, an opinion on a hierarchy being expressed here, were the wider reaches of the Cold War, limiting Soviet power coupled with upholding the domino theory. On a domestic level, internal politics also came into play. The war can be viewed as a vehicle for Truman to prove his anti-communist credentials. Hence, the protection of American interests in Japan and the Pacific was instead part of a local application of containment, and thus not the sole factor leading to the conflict. This is a planned introduction for a planned essay. It feels as if I'm almost reading the conclusion to this particular assignment. The wider context of the Cold War is crucial in understanding American involvement in the Korean conflict. The build-up to the Korean War was marked by rising tension, the Soviets gaining the atomic bomb just 12 months before Kim invaded the South. We have our context here. Stalin also made gains in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland and East Germany, among the newest members of the Soviet's empire or sphere of influence. The actions of the Soviet Union were perceived to be a test by many in the West of their resolve and willingness to act. The failure of Nazi appeasement in the 1930s in Europe was clearly in the minds of the Americans in the 1950s. The Americans, therefore, became involved in the Korean conflict due to the political posturing of the Cold War, highlighted as analysis linking back to the introduction. Stalin was viewed as the aggressor, and Kim's invasion of the South was just the latest example of his aggression. Essentially, the Truman administration had to act in order to prove itself a viable opponent to the tyranny of communism. Stalin needed to be prevented from taking control, or else his actions would spiral out of control, as Hitler's had 2 decades previously. Furthermore, the actions of Kim directly threatened the United States' sphere of influence. The Soviets were actively pursuing an expansionist agenda, infringing into the independence of a capitalist state. This was unacceptable, affront to a superpower such as the US, and thus garnered much support for intervention in Korea. Essentially, the war was a matter of reaffirming American power as limiting that of the Soviets. Analysis linked back to the question. This infringement of a sphere of influence links to another ideology that pushed the Americans into war, domino theory, attempting here to link factors. There was the genuine fear that if South Korea fell to communism, so would Japan and subsequently Indochina, etc. The importance of South Korea was intrinsically insignificant. Rhee's authoritarian, corrupt regime was hardly an advert for democracy, yet the fall of the South would mark another loss to communism and provide encouragement to communists worldwide that they had the upper hand. This can be further demonstrated in the fall of Chiang in China. The victory of communist forces put this domino theory firmly into focus. This is identifying further context. Now, arguably, this could have been introduced earlier, but it's brought into play here. The threat of a communist domination was very much real. The United States' involvement in the Korean War can be viewed as a response to this spread of communism. Therefore, after losing a crucial ally in China, they could not allow another ally to fall in Asia. Furthermore, the involvement of the US can be viewed as proving that the fight against communism had not already been lost. For a fearful American public, a strong front against the spread of communism was necessary to alleviate domestic concerns. Once again, an emerging superpower had to reassert its strength in the world and prove it was a genuine global power. Once again, we are going back to the question and explaining American intervention and motivation for it. The involvement of the US in the war can also be attributed to domestic politics, again mentioned as one of the factors in the planned introduction. The advent of McCarthyism is of particular importance. Communist subversives were, incorrectly, blamed for undermining the American establishment, a supposed enemy from within. Furthermore, the fall of China had resulted in a major backlash for the Truman administration. A perception of Truman being soft on communism was capitalized by the Republican Party during the upcoming election campaign. Hence, leading to a consequence, the involvement of the Americans in Korea, in part, held its roots within the US itself. Truman needed an opportunity to prove his resolve against the Soviets, and Kim's invasion of the South provided convenient means by which to do so. One can cynically view this domestic influence, therefore, as a very much significant issue. On a personal level, the war was a blessing for Truman, and for all the death and destruction, Truman emerged primarily better off because of it. Korea was to be Truman's redemption, employing the tried and tested method of using a conflict to unite a polarized electorate. Focusing on the local application of containment, the US did become involved in the Korean War due to her stake in rebuilding Japan. Japan was to become a new beacon of democracy in East Asia, an outpost of the US to demonstrate American power. This was highlighted by Dean Rusk, warning that a communist Korea was a dagger at the heart of Japan. Furthermore, in National Security Council Report 48, committed the US to defending Japan, along with the islands along the Pacific Rim, as a crucial aspect of containment. Thus, the US became involved in the Korean War in part was due to her Japanese interests. A communist Korea would undermine all American efforts in Japan. Such an eventuality would be quite literally a dagger that could cause severe harm to the security of the new Japanese government and thus subsequently harming Truman's policy of containment. Ultimately, the Americans could not afford to lose such an important, irreplaceable asset in the Far East. The Japanese economy also led to American involvement in the Korean War. The need to ensure prosperous trade links for the country was paramount. Ree's Korea was to form the main trading partner for Japan as the economies of both countries grew. Ultimately, the intention of this was to provide an oasis of economic advancement and wealth in Asia, away from the austerity and hardship under the Soviets, the Democratic Republic of Korea, the North, and later Maoist China. South Korea, therefore, was an essential link in making Japan a successful nation, which in turn would facilitate the policy of containment in East Asia. American involvement in the conflict in Korea can therefore be viewed as protecting one link in the chain of containment. The preservation of Ree's regime in the South was essential to the survival of capitalist Japan, and the preservation of a pro-American government in Japan was essential to limiting the expanse of communism in Asia and ultimately the world. Are we seeing here how we are linking one factor to another, showing this continuity of understanding and how one event is leading to another? Thus, the involvement of the US was not a generous gesture of support to the Japanese people. It was rather simply ensuring that foreign policy could be carried out successfully. An affluent Japan was as much an American desire as a Japanese one. The United States' involvement in the Korean War was therefore multi-causal. Japan and the US sphere of influence in the Pacific were two such causes, an essential part of US foreign policy in the Far East and the policy of containment. However, the global effect of the Cold War also influenced the intervention by the US. The posturing of the US and the Soviets resulted in the Korean War being an ideological conflict as well as a local civil war. It is ultimately this deep ingrained sense of rivalry that compelled Truman to act. So this is the key reason. Once again, already stated back at the beginning, we are simply stating what we have already said. Additionally, the domestic political context is significant. Truman saw Korea as a way of garnering the support of the electorate during the fragile period of American politics. Therefore, the US did not become involved in the Korean War solely because of her interest in Japan and the Pacific. The reasoning was instead three-tiered: the local application of containment, the wider Cold War context, standing up to the Soviets, and the domestic context, the demonstration of Truman as a strong leader. The conclusion here is essentially a rewrite of the planned, contrived structure introduced in the introduction. The student has said what they're going to do. In the main part of the essay, they do it, and in the conclusion, they say what they've done. An essay is a contrived, planned, and structured response to a statement expressing an argument, explaining how it's going to be done, providing the context, doing it, disproving any counter-arguments, and arriving at a conclusion to support the planned introduction that you initially started with.